On April 18, 1955, Albert Einstein died in a hospital in Princeton, New Jersey. Within hours, his brain was no longer in his body. It was sitting in a jar of formaldehyde in the basement of that same hospital. And the man who put it there had no permission to do it. Let's start with what Einstein actually wanted. He had been very clear about it. He wanted to be cremated. No funeral, no grave, no shrine. Nothing that could turn his death into a spectacle. He didn't want people worshiping his remains the way they worshipped relics of saints. His family followed his wishes almost to the letter. Almost. Because the pathologist on duty that night, a man named Thomas Harvey, had other plans. Harvey performed the autopsy, and during that autopsy, he removed Einstein's brain, weighed it, and simply kept it. He didn't ask the family first. He didn't ask the hospital board. He just took it, sealed it in jars, and walked away with what was, at that moment, one of the most famous organs on the planet. When the story broke in the newspapers the next day, it caused outrage. Einstein's son, Hans Albert, was furious. But Harvey, instead of returning it, did something strange. He called the family and made a case. He told them this wasn't theft, it was science. He argued that Einstein's brain held secrets about genius itself, secrets that could help humanity for generations. Eventually, under pressure, Hans Albert gave a kind of reluctant blessing, on one condition. The research had to be serious, and the findings had to be published in respected scientific journals. Harvey promised he would. He did not keep that promise, not for a long time. What he did instead was almost unbelievable. He took the brain to a lab and had it sliced into roughly 240 pieces, embedded in blocks of a material called celloidin. He photographed it from every angle, and then he put the pieces in jars and in mason jars and eventually in a cardboard box that once held apple cider, and he simply kept them for decades. Harvey lost his job at the hospital not long after the controversy. His marriage fell apart. He moved across the country, from state to state, job to job, sometimes working as a medical technician in places with no connection to neuroscience at all. And through all of it, he carried the box, Albert Einstein's brain, riding in the trunk of his car through one move after another for over 40 years. For most of that time, almost nobody knew where it was. The world's most famous brain had effectively vanished. Then, in 1978, a journalist named Stephen Levy tracked Harvey down. He found him living a quiet, almost forgotten life in Wichita, Kansas. Levy asked him directly, "Do you still have it?" And Harvey walked over to a cardboard box on the floor, pulled out a mason jar, and there it was. Pieces of Einstein's brain, floating in liquid, sitting in a box in a closet in Kansas. The story exploded again, but here's the part that's almost funnier than the rest. For years, Harvey had been quietly mailing small samples of the brain to researchers who asked for them, almost like he was running a strange, private postal service for pieces of Einstein. No formal study, no oversight, just an envelope, a slice of tissue, and a return address. Eventually, some of those samples did lead to real research. In 1985, a neuroscientist named Marion Diamond published a study comparing samples of Einstein's brain to the brains of other men his age. She found that in certain regions, particularly ones linked to complex thinking, Einstein had a notably higher ratio of glial cells, the support cells that help neurons function, to neurons themselves. Other researchers later examined photographs of the brain's structure and found unusual patterns in the parietal lobe, the region associated with spatial reasoning and mathematical thinking. Some scientists pointed out that Einstein's brain was missing a particular groove that most brains have, possibly allowing neurons in that area to communicate more directly. But here's the catch that almost never gets mentioned. Critics pointed out that all of these studies were working from a sample size of one brain, no control group of other brilliant scientists to compare against. Correlation isn't causation, and a handful of unusual measurements from a single specimen handled for decades in mason jars and cardboard boxes by a man with no neuroscience credentials isn't exactly a controlled experiment. In 1998, more than 40 years after that night in Princeton, Harvey finally returned most of the remaining brain to the hospital where it had all started. He was in his 80s by then. He died a few years later. And Einstein's brain, the one he asked to be cremated along with the rest of him, still sits today in jars in a pathology collection, pieces of it scattered among labs that received samples decades ago, studied, photographed, argued over. The man who discovered that time itself isn't fixed, that it bends and stretches depending on where you stand, ended up with a body that was treated exactly the opposite way he wanted: permanent, preserved, unable to rest. Sometimes the most human thing about a story of genius isn't the genius at all. It's what the people around them decide to do once they're gone.